Hello, I'm Krista Ann. This is not a bucket list video this week. This is a story behind the bucket list. One of the things people often ask me is, what do you do for a living? What's my job? And I'm a knitter and crocheter for the film and TV industry. I've worked with some fashion designers as well. And so I create knits, and usually it's knit, sometimes it's crochet as well, for Hollywood. It's a pretty cool job. I can do it from basically anywhere as long as I can send and receive mail. And so I, about half the time out of the year, work out of my RV. I spent 5.5 years with my husband and our baby Finny, who's up there, sleeping in the top bunk, traveling around the US and full-time in our RV. And I did a lot of work from the road back then, and now we're only on the road part-time, but I still continue to do a lot of work and work with costume designers. I know it's a bit of a crazy story, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about what my job is like, how I got into this business, and sort of walk you through sort of what the process is when I do get a job to work on. So let's go ahead and kind of get into this crazy story. Looks like the baby's awake. So I'm going to back up just a little bit, because when you're traveling a lot and you meet people on tours or at restaurants or just out in the wild, and they ask where you're from, and I say, oh, well, right now we're living in an RV, we're traveling around the country. One of the questions they always ask is, oh, well, what do you do for a living? Because that's a legitimate question. How do you have a job that can be anywhere in an RV? And I tell them that I'm a professional knitter and crocheter. And of course, I get sort of weird looks, and one of the first things they say is, oh, do you sell your items on Etsy? And I tell them very respectfully, no, I don't. Etsy is highly oversaturated and undervalues what the knitting and crochet community does. So I do not sell my items on Etsy, and I tell them I actually knit and crochet for the film industry. And of course, that's not a common job. It is a totally legitimate job, and it's one that I am very lucky to have. And so I tell them, sometimes if you're watching a movie and you see a hand knit piece or hand crocheted piece, whether it's be an actor wearing it or maybe it's a blanket on a couch, that all has to be made by someone. And I am one of those lucky someones that gets to do that job every once in a while. And that's what kind of pays for this lifestyle and my ability to travel. So I work with costume designers, usually directly or with their assistants. And I'm going to be totally honest that I have to be a little bit vague about what I talk about, because it is a bit of a hush-hush industry. And one of the reasons I do get the jobs I get is because I keep my mouth shut. I don't say anything until I'm allowed to. And I will tell you, sometimes it's a year or two from when I make a piece to when it actually gets onto the screen and I actually can talk about it. That discreetness is what helps me continue to build my career, build my resume, and work with more costume designers. So I am going to be a little bit vague, and that's not to try and gatekeep anything. That's just to be respectful to the costume designers that I work with. But I can show you the things from my side of the fence of what I do and how my job works for me and how I'm able to do it in an RV and all that good stuff. I did not wake up one day with the thought of I'm going to knit or crochet for the industry. I started as a hobby knitter, just like just about everybody else. I learned when I was in my early 20s during college, and it helped me survive college, and was just doing it for the love of it. I took a million classes. Anytime I could take a local class or go to a convention, I was constantly taking classes to just learn more. And so I began to develop my skills, and over the years just kind of got a bit of a reputation around the sort of local knitting community, that I was a very fast knitter, and it was something that I really enjoyed. I loved knitting, and then I learned how to crochet. At the time, I was living in the Los Angeles area, which of course is center of Hollywood. And to make a very long story short, basically what happened was I had been told about somebody looking for a knitter for a movie, and ended up talking with this person. They were a machine knitter, not a hand knitter, and they needed some hand knit pieces. And so I worked with her for a little bit, and then I started to learn that this was a job, and that it was something that I was actually getting kind of good at. And so I learned that this was a thing, to work with costume designers. And there was an event that was happening in LA. It was for people that wanted to be stylists. It was called FashionistaCon, which I think is really funny because I have no idea how I got on their mailing list. I am so not a fashionista, but I was on their mailing list, and I got this email about this convention happening in Los Angeles. And it was for stylists or people who wanted to be stylists. And there was 4 or 5 different panels, and one of the panels was costume designers. And there was 4 people on the costume designer board. And I think the event cost about $400. I don't remember exactly. I remember it being a large chunk of money at the time. And I'm really not the type of personality that just like goes out and introduces myself to people. And so I thought if I'm going to spend $400 on this event, I was going to get my business card into each of those 4 costume designers' hands. Long story short, I did. I met all 4 of them. They were all wonderful. One of those that I met was a gentleman named Salvador Perez, and he was doing the costumes for the Mindy Project, which starred Mindy Kaling. And basically through a series of a literal year of every like 3 to 6 months, sending an email just saying, hey, just checking in, see if you need anything. At about the 1 year mark, I did get a response from him, and he invited me to the Edith Head building, which is in downtown Burbank, right on the lot where the whole backlot area is. That's also where the Mindy Project was being filmed. And I went down and chatted with him. He gave me an order for 6 items. I think it was 2 skirts and 4 vests. And I had about 2 months to do it. And it was all on size 2 needles. And so I, for the next 2 months, just knit my little butt off. I had some dimensions, some measurements. I also had a physical piece that she had worn that fit her well, and I used that for sizing. And after about 2 months, I went back in, dropped them off. He did the fitting. I got an email saying, these are amazing, they fit great. There was, I think, 1 or 2 pieces I had to make some small alterations to, but it was a success. And so I came back in, and I ended up doing a lot of pieces for the Mindy Project. I honestly lost track of how many I did, but I'm sure it was upwards of 25 or 30. And Salvador Perez happened to be the president of the CDGA, which is the Costume Designers Guild Association. And so he knew like everybody in the industry. And he was so kind and wonderful. And he posted pictures on Instagram and tagged me in them and was super supportive. And from there, my name just kind of started to get passed around. And that was probably 12 or 13 years ago. Oh boy, I don't know how long ago it was. It was a while ago. And so my sort of name has sort of been passed around the industry and grown from that. I work for many costume designers that got my name either from him or from friends of friends. So I've been very lucky to be able to work on a lot of projects. At the time, it wasn't enough to pay the bills, but I was able to just sort of sock that money away and save it for travel. At the time, my husband was working full-time in the video game industry, and so he was paying our main bills while I was building my business. So shout out to him for being super supportive and allowing me to work on those years of building the business. And it kind of snowballed from there. I was spending a lot of time sitting on the couch, knitting for hours and hours and hours on these crazy tight deadlines, watching shows about travel, any kind of travel shows, whether it was like a ghost hunting show where they talked about the history of different places, or it was any Josh Gates show where he was traveling to all over the world and doing these amazing things. And I've always had a love for travel. I've always just wanted to go everywhere and do everything. And I kind of started to get a little bit depressed because I was sitting on a couch in Los Angeles, one of the most expensive cities in the country, working on a project that I was shipping to either another state or even another country. And I was just watching other people's adventures. And it kind of started to make me a little bit sad because I wanted to be having my own adventures. And so I started getting a little bit of a idea here of this idea that I could travel while still working. And I had grown up RVing. That was something that we've done ever since I was born. And so I kind of got this idea of maybe becoming sort of like a digital nomad, being able to work from anywhere. And it took about 5 years of building my business and getting to a point where we were able to sell our house, move into an RV, and hit the road. So in August of 2019, we sold just about everything we owned, moved into the RV that we had purchased like the year before, and sort of set out on this adventure. Part of the deal of doing this was that Garner, my husband, was able to retire. And so he retired and just became a full-time cat dad. He's also been super supportive, and he's the one who takes packages to the mailbox when I finish them after an all-night knitting session. While I sleep, he runs to the post office, so he's been super supportive and definitely been a huge part of why this adventure has been able to be possible. And so since I was shipping pieces all over the world, it really didn't matter where my home base was. And so August of 2019, the adventure officially began. I'm not going to go too deep into the whole traveling thing. We're going to talk about the actual knitting and crocheting for the industry. What does it look like? What does it look like from my end? What I'll say is it's very different for every project. No project ever runs exactly the same unless I'm working continually on a show or a project. And so what it is I'm usually contacted by a costume designer or an assistant. I will either get a text or an Instagram message or an email, and they'll just say, hey, I'm working on this project. This is what I'm looking for. And the first question they always ask is, how much does that cost? And I've definitely gotten really good about handling this question, because if you're a knitter or a crocheter, you know that there is a vast difference from one sweater to another, from one hat to another. Whether you're talking about the difficulty of the project, is it just a straight stockinette stitch in the round hat? Easy peasy. Is there a weight of yarn that they require? Is it a skinny yarn, meaning a thin yarn, a lot more knitting, a lot more time? Or is it a super chunky yarn that is for a quick project? And then there's the quality of the yarn. Of course, if they want 100% cashmere, which I have been requested to have 100% cashmere, do they want 100% cashmere, or is acrylic okay? What's their budget? Can I work within their budget? There's a million questions that go around. The other thing I have to consider is the actor and their allergies, or if they're vegan. That is something that I have learned to ask, because either sometimes an actor can be allergic to something, or sometimes they are vegan and choose not to wear animal fibers, which is all totally fine. Those are just things that I have to factor into the cost, and then whether or not I'm actually going to be able to fulfill that order in the time given. So my number one question is, well, what's your deadline? Their number one question is, what's the cost? And so after some back and forth, we get each other's questions answered. I know what the project is, I know what the timeline is, I know what their budget is, and then I start to source yarn. And sourcing yarn is probably one of the hardest parts of the job, only because you can't see accurate colors on a screen. And that's any screen. So either I'm shopping for yarn online and I can't see accurate colors online, or I'm in the store and I'm sending them pictures of the yarn and they're not seeing fully accurate colors of the picture from the pictures. I'm going to use Stranger Things as an example. I was incredibly lucky to be able to work on both seasons 4 and 5 of Stranger Things, and they had such a long lead time that what I was able to do was go out, buy a couple skeins of yarn, knit up a swatch, and actually send it to them, so they were able to see it in person. That is very rare to be able to do that, for them to actually be able to see those swatches in person. But because they had such a long timeline and such a long lead, that I was able to do that. And so that was a huge project. And so it was a lot of back and forth, being able to send swatches, get feedback, and it was a long process, and I loved it. It was so relaxing having nice long deadlines, because I will tell you, that is not always the case. As far as the design of the piece, it's not uncommon for me to get either a sketch or a picture. Sometimes I'm sent an actual physical piece that's vintage, and it's either falling apart, or it doesn't fit the actor, or they need multiples. There's a lot of things, and I do work with a lot of vintage pieces that they then say, hey, we want to do this. So for example, for season 4, I did the mustard and burgundy sweater that Murray wore, and they had a vintage piece and they sent it to me, and the original had a zipper, but they wanted buttons. And of course it had to fit him specifically, and they needed to have a second one for the stunt double. And so it's not uncommon for me to need to make very copious, detailed notes, so that when I go to make multiples, I can quickly and easily do it without having it differ from the first one. That's a very important thing. And so once the piece is knit, I block it, ship it off, they do a fitting, and then sometimes I'll get notes. So for example, for like the Mindy Project, every once in a while I'll have to make like maybe a vest, the hem a little bit longer, or I need to bring the armhole up a little bit, or I need to change the neck shaping. So I'll get kind of notes. When I did Nancy's vest for season 5 of Stranger Things, I sent off the first one, and there was like one color that they didn't particularly like the placement of, so we had to adjust that. The collar needed to be a little bit different, so we had to make an adjustment for that. There were several just little tiny notes that needed to be done, and when they have a lot of time, we can make those adjustments. But I don't always have that time. I did a sweater for the Dexter show. I think it's Dexter it was Dexter Origins. And I had 10 days to recreate a sweater for a stunt double, and it was size 0 needles for basically a man's large. He was about the size of my husband. And so that was That was a fun project. It was super stressful and my fingers hurt like crazy when that project was done. I try not to take on those projects anymore because they're just so stressful, and honestly, I'm getting older and I can't pull all-nighters like I used to be able to. But we love that show. We're actually rewatching that show right now, the whole from the beginning, and so I had to say yes to that. So sometimes I'll say yes to a project just because I love the show and I want to work on it. And so sometimes I just say yes, even though I know it's probably going to be a bit of a nightmare for me. I just am super excited to work on the project and have a little piece of that history. And so that was a really fun project. Stressful, but fun. And so each project, as you can see, is just a little bit different depending on the costume designer, what they're looking for, the actor. I've definitely had projects where I've knit a piece out of a certain fiber and the actor hasn't liked the fiber, or the costume designer hasn't. The costume designer always knows like where the piece is going to be used in a film. One of the things that they always ask for is the ability to do multiples. I do multiples quite often. I tend to know whether or not it's going to see action in like a fight scene if I have to do a lot of multiples. For example, Murray's scarf in season 4 of Stranger Things, I had to do quite a few multiples of that, and of course it saw action, so there were stunt doubles. There was, possible rips or tears because of the action scene happening. I don't get a whole lot of details and I don't ask for them, but I do know if I'm making a lot of them that something's going to happen. Same with Nancy's vest for season 5. I don't even remember how many multiples I did of that. It had to have been at least 15, because if I don't want to ruin anything, if you haven't watched season 5 of Stranger Things yet, first of all, it's an amazing show. It was like an absolute dream to work on that show, but it gets a little messy. And so I now know why I had to do so many multiples of that. The other thing that's interesting about that project is they film in Atlanta. And if you've ever been to Atlanta in the summer, it is a little hot and a little bit humid. And that was 3 strands of fingering weight wool held together for a vest, and it got a little warm. And so they asked for things like just the front of the piece with the full collar, so that they could put a mesh on the back to keep the actress cool. And so there's all these like little things that you end up doing, which is really cool. And then when I watch the show, I'm always like looking like, can I figure out which piece that was? And they all look exactly the same. So I can't ever tell. But it is fun to watch when my pieces come on the screen. To tell you the truth, it does make me a little bit uncomfortable just because, I don't know, it's like, it's just like a little piece of me that's part of the show, and because I'm so critical of my work, I'll see little things that I'm like, oh, I should change that just a little bit right there, or I should have moved that neckline up just a little bit. Like, I'm just super self-critical of my work, and that's just me, but honestly, that makes me get better and better each time, and that's the only way that I learn, is by looking at my work, seeing what needs to be corrected for the next one, and trying to make it better the next time. I did work on all of the Stranger Things pieces from the RV, which was pretty cool. We call our RV Finny's Chariot because that's Finny, and this is her chariot. Takes her around to new adventures and new sights and everything. And so I did get to work on all of those projects straight here from the RV, and it was really funny because Amy Paris, who's the costume designer, would email me or text me and be like, hey, where in the world are you right now? And I'd be like, oh, we're in Idaho or Montana or Virginia or whatever. And it was just really fun. And then when I was actually passing through Atlanta, I was able to sit down and have a nice cup of coffee with her. They weren't filming at the time. This was during the event of the strikes when I think it was the writers or actors strike. And so she was in town ready to start filming, but it got postponed again. Even after COVID, it got postponed again. And so I was able to go and hang out with her, and that was really fun. And we talked business and then talked just a lot about travel, because costume designers get to travel a lot, which I'm super jealous about. And so since I've been back on the road, I've had 2 projects that have come in that I've knit up, sent off, and eventually someday I'll be able to get to show you. Be sure to subscribe to my channel because I do give more information once I'm allowed to here on the channel. And so once I'm able to talk about a project, I'll give you a little bit of an insight to it. So make sure you subscribe so that you find out what those projects are when I can announce them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the constraints that I have with doing this job from the road. The first is if we're moving quickly at all, I have to have yarn shipped either overnight or second day, because if I'm at a campground for, say, a week, which sounds like a long time, Sometimes I don't always get the yarn right away, and so I have to be very careful and cognizant of how long it takes to ship. There's a couple of places that I do ship from regularly because they have a great selection, and I also know that they ship quickly, and so that's very important. And one of the other things is that the physical limits of the space that we have can be a little bit of an issue. I often have to have a piece blocking in the middle of the floor. I try to do it overnight, so in the middle of the night when you get up to use the restroom, to walk from the bedroom to the bathroom, there's a little bit of stepping over some pieces that are blocking. Not really a big deal. I haven't had any like massive blankets that I've had to block from the road, but I definitely have vests and sweaters, and right now there's a dress on the floor for another project, not for a film project, but I have a dress on the floor that's blocking. And so that's just one of the physical things you have to worry about as far as space. Our RV is an Imagine Grand Design 26-foot RB meaning rear bath. So from the tongue to the back is about 26 feet. And then we're about 8 feet wide, and then an additional maybe 3 feet wide when we put the slide out. And so space is very limited in here. And when we were living in here for 5.5 years, we had basically everything we owned in here. And so it was all about being a minimalist, keeping things organized, and then just having a really understanding husband that was willing to step over knitted pieces sitting on a blocking mat for 24 hours. One of the other things is that finding a yarn shop isn't always possible. I was in Dead Horse Ranch State Park, and I did get a message for a project to be worked on. I did know of one yarn store in the area, and luckily they had a yarn that was going to work for the project, but we couldn't ship yarn to that place. It's a state park. You can't ship yarn to a front office. And so I was very lucky that there was actually a yarn store there. And so that is definitely one of the things that I have to worry about when I'm on the road, and make sure that before I accept a job that I can actually source the yarn. Because some costume designers are really picky about yarn, whether it be the color, the fiber, the texture, the size. There's a lot of pickiness to that because, you know, it needs to fit what they're doing and what their vision is. I 100% agree with that. They need to be picky about that. And some costume designers are just like, you know, I just need this color. I just need a blue, like a dark blue. Dark blue is not really a good example because there's a million shades of dark blue. I just need like a traffic cone orange or something like that. Like they're not super specific about stuff like that. And so it all depends on what the costume designer is trying to match with. If they're trying to match a very specific fabric to a jacket or a skirt or a scene or a mood or a feel, I just have to make sure that I can provide them with the yarn that's going to work for that project. And that is probably the most stressful part. Once I get the yarn nailed down and they're good with it, the actual knitting of the piece or the actual crocheting of the piece is really not too bad. That's the easy part. The other thing that I've sort of touched on a little bit is deadlines. When I first started this, I would take on any project, even if the deadline was kind of stupid. I had a fashion designer that contacted me, and he needed 3 sweaters in 10 days. They were on worsted weight yarn, so it's a little bit of a thicker yarn. It wasn't like the one sweater on size 0 needles in 10 days, but it was still 3 sweaters in 10 days. 2 of the things I learned very early in my career was, 1, do not take on a project that I do not like, that physically cannot be done in the time frame. There was a project that I did. I knit the first one, and it took me about 8 days to do the project. And then it takes me a little bit less to do the second one if they need a multiple, because I already have the pattern written, the swatches done, all that stuff. I just have to physically knit it. But the first one took 8 days, and then they needed the second one in like 3 days, but they didn't tell me about the second one. And I stayed up 2 days in a row knitting that piece where I was literally hallucinating, and I didn't finish it in time. And it caused some problems, and so I definitely learned, do not take on a project that I cannot finish in the timeline. And now that I'm getting a little bit older and can't do those all-nighters, I do tend to turn down projects that are on timelines that are just not going to physically be able to do. I can't do them. And that's okay. I'm good with that, because the stress of not getting a project done on the timeline that the costume designer needs way outweighs the stress of what I could have spent that money on. And the second thing I learned is taking the most detailed notes possible in a short amount of time. I write all my notes on my phone in Krista speak, so if I were to give that note to somebody else, they probably wouldn't be able to recreate the project because it's in my own language, and that's all I need. But taking super detailed notes is so important to being able to be successful with doing this project, because they don't always tell you that they need a second one. I did a crochet shawl for the movie Tag, which was a really super fun project. Ed Helms wore that piece, so I've now put pieces on Mindy Kaling and Ed Helms. My goal is to get like all of the people from The Office because I love that show. So I crocheted up the first one, and I did take notes, but I was not told about a second one. And then I got a call from the costume designer saying, it's perfect, we love it, we want a second one for the stunt double. Can you do that? And if I had not made like super detailed notes, it would have been a very stressful situation. So taking absolutely detailed notes, as detailed as possible, super important. So fast forward to today, we are no longer on the road full-time, we're on the road part-time. We came off the road from full-time travel in about January of 2025. And took a year off, just moving into our condo, settling down. I was trying to get just sort of a better work-life balance. And then I definitely got itchy and needed to get back on the road. So now we're back on the road for about 8 months, traveling around the country, back in the RV, and I love it. We're back at home. Finny's loving it. She's back at home. She's got new views about every week. But I'm definitely being more careful about what projects I take on now, because just because you physically can do a project for Hollywood doesn't mean you absolutely should, especially if the timing is just not working out. One of the reasons that we came off the road was because I was just getting a lot of work, which is great, and I'm super proud of that, and I'm very lucky that I was getting all that work. But we would travel to a new place, we'd park, we'd set up, and then I would just work for like 6 days straight. And we were in this new place that I'd never been, and it was when we were in about Little Rock, Arkansas, that I'd never been there before. And I was just working from sunup to sundown. All I was doing was working. And I think we got out twice during my time there. Didn't get to see anything. And so that was kind of when we decided that we needed to come off the road full time. We also had some issues with the RV. Some things sort of started breaking down. And so we needed to come off the road just to get the RV fixed and give it a little bit of a break. Give me a little bit of a break. And now I'm back. I'm refreshed. I'm doing this 1,000 bucket list adventure challenge. Some of it's going to be done in the RV, some of it's international travel, but it is definitely now about that work-life balance, taking on projects that I want to do, that I can do, that are, in my timeline, that are not going to get me stuck in a beautiful place, not being able to go out and enjoy it. And I'm pretty happy about that. So that's a little bit about what I do, what my job is. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have questions for me, I am more than happy to answer them. Please drop them in the comments below. Let me know what you're wondering about my job. It's a weird one, it's a great one, it's a crazy one, I love it, but I am more than happy to answer your questions. And so I am now going to sign off. Finny is still passed out. I'm going to go ahead and get back to work. I am working on a project right now that needs to ship in 2 days. So I'm going to get that finished up, send it off, and go back to the adventuring because I have 1,000 bucket list adventures that I'm checking off. As of this video, I've checked off 4 of them. So be sure to go back and check out those adventures. Because knitting and crochet are such a huge part of my life, and they're also the reason that I'm able to live this RV life and this nomad life and this travel life. I do at the end of all my videos have a short knitting or crochet tutorial just because I love knitting and crochet so much. And so if you are a knitter or crocheter, please be sure to watch all the way to the end and check out that tip. So I will put the link to my first 4 bucket list items in the description below so you can check those out. Next week, you're going to get to see another bucket list item. This one was super fun and like a very high flying thrill ride. And so be sure and subscribe. Like this video, comment below. It really does help out my channel. I'm a brand new channel, I'm growing, and I'm super excited to share this life with you. So thanks so much for joining me on this. I look forward to reading your comments and answering your questions, and I'm gonna get back to work while Finny sleeps. Bye. In this video, I feature the Sunrise Butte hat. The link to the pattern is in the description below, and it is designed using a strand of mohair and a strand of DK merino, and it creates this really nice little halo effect that I really like. And I remember the very first time I was working a project where 2 strands were held together like this, and the person at the yarn shop that sold me the yarn suggested that I wind the 2 strands together so that they are one cake of yarn. Which in theory is a great idea, but in practicality it was a terrible idea because inevitably one strand gets pulled more than the other, and then you have this one cake of yarn that you can't separate it because the yarns are wound together, and one's going to end up, it's usually the mohair, with this big extra bit of yarn out like this, and you're trying to work with this piece of strand of mohair and constantly pulling it down, and it created a mess. So I learned from my mistake, and don't do that. Keep them separated. I often use these yarn cozies. I always have a big pile of them in my knitting area because I use them all the time, and they will keep your yarn nice and separated, nice and clean. I'll put a link to where you can get those as well in the description, but don't wind them together. Keep them separate, and that way you don't have to worry about that extra bit of mohair, because it will be the mohair, that ends up becoming quite a nightmare. Also, when you finish the project, you don't have to keep those two yarns together. You can use those yarns for separate things if you want. They're not forever married to each other because they've been wound together. So learn from my mistakes, don't wind them together, keep them separated, keep them cozy, keep them clean, and it will make your project and your knitting so much nicer.